Hey guys, this is Steve. We're going to try and do things a little quicker. I think more people would get into that. Sorry, got a really close look at my hat there. Today we're going to talk about how Christians are pretty much wrong about salvation. So salvation in the Bible is really different than salvation today. So today we talk about salvation. A lot of times we're talking about living forever with God and living forever, and being in heaven. And a lot of times for a lot of people, heaven has to do with living in a space that is free of the flesh and free of any body and all of the bodily functions and all of that kind of stuff. That doesn't really have anything to do with the kind of salvation that's in the Bible, anywhere in the Bible. But let's especially look at the Old Testament and kind of the foundation. When we look at the Old Testament, salvation means deliverance, specifically deliverance or freedom from oppression, meaning that we don't have to worry about oppression anymore. So oppression is like being enslaved or having essential items taken away from you, or things like that, and you have freedom from that. Nowadays, we like to talk about freedom from sin. But I think that maybe what the Bible talked about as sin and what we talk about as sin today are very different things. It's kind of right now we are using a matter of law of light. So we look at the Old Testament law and we say, well, here are all these purity laws, but we're not going to apply all of them. We're just going to dial it back some. So that way it's kind of, we're going to have purity, but we're going to have purity light. But the thing is that the purity laws doesn't have anything to do with the kind of salvation that the Bible is talking about. Salvation doesn't mean salvation in order to obey purity laws. It means salvation from the things that are restricting your freedom. So what are the things in the ancient world that are restricting freedom? So for instance, slavery. Slavery is something in the ancient world. Now, slavery in the ancient world was really different than what we would think of as slavery today. Slavery today, we think of that a certain race is put under slavery, and it doesn't and your kids are born slaves, and if you and your wife are both slaves, then you have no right to anything that you have, and you are stuck being a slave for the rest of your life unless your master happens to let you go free. In the ancient world, it's really different. So for instance, Romans, when they held slaves, generally a person wouldn't be a slave on average for longer than maybe 6 years of their life. Generally, what they would do is they would work for their master for the time that their master wants them to work, which might be half time. And then they would go and they would work for other people, earn money, and then buy their own purchase from their master. In the Hebrew point of view, at the same time, a person would not be a slave for longer than 7 years. And the reason is because if a person had to sell themselves and perhaps their family in order to pay off debts, they would become a slave. But then every 7 years would be a Sabbath year in which they would obtain freedom from their slavery. Also, there might be a Jubilee year, and in a Jubilee year, in the 50th year, they would get salvation, or they would get freedom from their slavery. And so this is and so slavery had a kind of a different, it was seen as a kind of a temporary thing. Now, sometimes you would have a king that would take a whole people and enslave them. For instance, like Solomon enslaved the people in the northern kingdom of Israel. People who are in Galilee or people who are in Samaria, he would enslave those people so they could come and work on his temple or work on his palace or do work in Jerusalem. That would be for part of every year. They would come down and do that work. But basically, slavery at that point means that you are not getting paid for work that you're doing, or it's an extra tax. But it was not a permanent state that you found yourself in. Now, there are people who would find themselves in a permanent state of slavery in the ancient world, people who were found of like Canaanites to the Hebrews. The Canaanites were often enslaved to the end of their days. But those were rare circumstances. That didn't happen very often. And usually even then, those Canaanites were able to live in their own villages, in their own towns, be able to work themselves, and then they would have to work for their overlords every once in a while. Once again, slavery in the ancient world is certainly considered oppression. There's no question about it. That is oppression. But even so, slavery in the ancient world wasn't as bad as what we do. In other words, we would say that those people were underemployed and that they were working harder than the wages that they were receiving. So a lot of people, when we talk about people having slave wages today, the ancient world would totally agree with that. Yeah, those are slave wages because they are working X amount of X hard, and they're not even able to make ends meet with that. That would be slave wages. And you notice that a lot of this has to do with debt. And debt in the ancient world was a huge issue of oppression. And so a person may get in a bad situation, end up being poor. And especially in an agricultural society, this happened a lot. If you have a bad year or a couple bad years of crops, you could end up owing people a lot of money in order to maintain those crops. Well, if you can't pay it back, then you may have to, there's a lot of options. So first of all, you may have to surrender some of your possessions as collateral. So for instance, a very poor person may have, all they have as their possession is their outer coat. They would have to give that coat as collateral until they could pay off the rest of the debt. Of course, according to the Mosaic law, that coat would have to be given back to that person during the night, so that way they could sleep in it. And so stay warm so they wouldn't die, so they could still pay off the debt. Or if a person spends a long time and they're not able to pay off their debt, then they may have to go into prison, because of course most jails were actually about collecting debt. And you would say, well, that seems pretty strange. Why would anyone who needed a debt paid, why would they throw them in jail? Well, the reason they would throw them in jail is because the debt is not only on a single person, a head of a family, but the whole family and their community. So if they want to have their family out of that debt, then they will collect from their community as much as they can to pay off that debt. And so you put someone in jail who is a bread earner in the hopes that everyone else will go out, collect money, and pay off the debt. But let's say that doesn't work either. That's when you get back into slavery. And so the person who is in jail says, well, I'm never going to be able to pay this back, so just throw me into slavery. And so they put them into slavery. Maybe they'll put their family into slavery if themselves being a slave isn't going to be enough to pay the debt. So they put themselves and family into slavery. And yes, they could be sold, and yes, they will be worked, but they can get themselves out of slavery after X many years as well, either by being able to purchase themselves out, or by a sabbatical year coming and freeing them. Another form of oppression in the ancient world is not having land. The fact is that it was given a given right that every family has land. In an agricultural society, this makes a lot of sense. You do not survive unless you have land. And so every family receives large parcels of land, and as the family grows, then that land is cut into smaller chunks in order to give to other people. Even if a person ends up selling their land, they sell their land for somebody else to use it, in reality, it's only a lease, because at the sabbatical year, every 50th year, all land reverts back to its original owner family. So it goes back to the family, and then they get to use it again. If they decide to sell it again in another 50 years, that goes back again to the family. Land is never actually sold. It is only leased for X amount of time, only up to 50 years. But the idea that a family wouldn't have land is an idea of oppression. And if you see the promises of salvation again and again throughout the Old Testament, you will see that a lot of it has to do with people regaining their land, getting their land again, of being able to live a life of freedom and deliverance again. And another thing that is brought up a number of times, but especially in Isaiah, is talking about illness, disease, and disability, and also mental illness. These, of course, are oppressions in the ancient world. These are considered to be oppressions because it's evil spirits that visit these upon people, sometimes for doing something bad, sometimes simply because these things happen. And so to obtain freedom from oppression also means getting freedom from illness or disability, things like that. So when you look at the ancient world, when they talk about salvation, they're not talking about salvation from sin or salvation from so much a sinful lifestyle, but specifically a salvation or deliverance from oppression. So freedom from slavery, freedom, which means freedom from being underemployed or working for slave wages, freedom from not having land, being able to obtain land, so not being homeless and not having to even be a renter, but owning your own land, freedom from the debts that are weighing you down, and freedom from illness and disease. And it's interesting. So a person who is an oppressor is a person who brings people slavery and takes away people's land and doesn't allow them to be healed and allows their debts to increase. Those are oppressors, people who are deliverers, who are people who save them, or people who restore people's land, who allow people to have healing, give people freedom from slave wages, and forgive their debts. These are the people who are saviors and heroes and deliverers. So it's interesting that nowadays we have people who are leaders who are of that first category, oppressors in the ancient world's eyes, rather than deliverers. Where are the deliverers? Where are the people who are going to set people free from debt, who give people homes that they can own, and who will set people free from unfair wages? And that actually would be a closer look to the kind of leadership that the Bible calls for and the kind of hope that the biblical Advent is looking for. All right, may the Lord bless you and keep you and give you peace.